50 years ago this week, the world watched as the Apollo 11 crew lifted off and then landed on the moon a few days later.
For 50 years, Michael Collins gave thousands of interviews and never once told the full truth about what Apollo 11 was really like. He was cheerful, he was philosophical, he was the forgotten astronaut who didn't walk on the moon and seemed perfectly fine with it. Then, in the final years before his death, something shifted. He started talking about the fear, about the plan nobody discussed publicly, about what he was prepared to do if his crewmates couldn't come back.
So I wasn't worried about the descent and the landing nearly as much as I was about their return. If that engine didn't ignite, there were 2 dead men on the moon, and there was nothing I could do about it. I didn't have any landing gear.
What he finally admitted wasn't what anyone expected. It reframes the most triumphant moment of the 20th century as something far more human, far more desperate, and far more terrifying than the story the world has been told. The man nobody remembered. On July 20th, 1969, while the world watched 2 men walk on the moon, a third man sat completely alone in a spacecraft the size of a station wagon, orbiting 60 miles above the lunar surface. His name was Michael Collins. He was the command module pilot of Apollo 11, and his job, the part nobody put in the history books, was to be ready to leave without them. Collins orbited the moon every 2 hours. For 48 minutes of every orbit, he passed behind the moon, and every radio link went dead. No mission control, no crewmates, no one. He was more isolated than any human being in recorded history, separated from every other living person by 250,000 miles, and then separated further by the bulk of the moon itself, rotating like a wall between him and the rest of the species. And here is where it gets strange. For over 50 years, Collins told a version of this story that was almost peaceful. He described the beauty of the craters, the strange meditative quiet, the philosophical satisfaction of solitude. He was the affable third astronaut, cheerful about being forgotten, comfortable in the background. The public believed it, the press repeated it, and Collins let them. In the final years before his death in April 2021, he stopped letting them. In interviews given for the 50th anniversary in 2019, and in his last public statements before cancer took him in April 2021 at age 90, Collins spoke with a candor that no one had heard from him before. What he admitted was not peaceful, it was not philosophical, it was a sustained private terror, and it revealed that Apollo 11 was far closer to catastrophe and far more human in its desperation than the triumphant story the world has been told for 5 decades. This is what he finally said, and this is why it changes everything. The road that almost ended. Michael Collins was born in Rome in 1930, son of a U.S. Army general. He attended West Point, flew F-86 Sabres, and tested experimental aircraft at Edwards Air Force Base, the same proving ground where test pilots died at a rate that made the work feel less like flying and more like controlled gambling. In 1963, NASA selected him for its 3rd astronaut class. His first flight, Gemini, and 10 in July. 1966 established him as one of the most technically precise pilots in the program. But here's the catch. In 1968, Collins developed a cervical disc herniation, serious enough to require surgery. It pulled him off the prime crew of Apollo 8, the first manned mission to orbit the moon, and left him watching from the ground as other astronauts did what he had trained for, not knowing if his spine would ever clear him to fly again. It did. He was assigned to Apollo 11 as command module pilot, not the most glamorous seat. He would not walk on the moon, not plant the flag, not leave boot prints in the dust that would outlast every human civilization. But his role carried something the other 2 seats did not. It carried a classified contingency plan he never once discussed publicly. For 50 years. The plan nobody talked about. NASA plans for everything. That is not a platitude. In the Apollo era, it was a religion. Engineers identified every conceivable failure mode. Flight. Controllers drilled scenarios they prayed would stay theoretical. Astronauts memorized procedures for emergencies that existed only on paper. One of those contingencies was almost never mentioned publicly until years after the mission, and it sat at the center of every hour Collins spent orbiting the moon alone. The scenario. Armstrong and Aldrin land successfully. The lunar module's ascent engine fails to ignite, or the ascent stage fails to separate from the descent stage. The two astronauts are alive on the surface, alive, with oxygen measured in hours and no way up. Collins' instructions in that scenario were precise and merciless. He would continue orbiting. He would keep communication open as long as possible, give them time to say goodbyes, record messages to their families, transmit whatever they needed to transmit, several orbits, a matter of hours. And then he would perform the trans-Earth injection burn that would pull Columbia out of lunar orbit and begin the 3-day journey back to Earth without them. President Nixon had a speech written for that outcome. It had already been drafted, sitting in a White House folder, ready to be delivered. It began. Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. Collins had been briefed on this. He had rehearsed the undocking procedures for separating from a dead lunar module. He had practiced the calculations for the burn that would take him home alone. He knew the speech existed. He had thought in concrete detail about what it would mean to fire that engine, to hear his crewmates' voices one final time, and then accelerate away from the moon and spend 3 days alone in a spacecraft that was supposed to carry 3 men home. He carried that knowledge into lunar orbit and never once spoke about it publicly, not for 50 years. And get this, the story gets worse from here, because the contingency plan was not the most frightening part of what Collins was holding. The most frightening part was what he was listening for in the transmissions from the surface, and what happened during the landing that no one in that spacecraft fully understood in real time. If you've ever wondered why the official story of Apollo 11 always felt a little too clean, a little too triumphant, this is the part that explains it. Subscribe so you don't miss the stories that didn't make the textbook. The hours alone. When Armstrong and Aldrin sealed the hatch of the lunar module Eagle and began their descent on July 20th, 1969, Collins entered a psychological ordeal that the triumphant narrative of Apollo 11 has never captured. He was alone in Columbia. The lunar module fell away below him, and Collins orbited, listening to every transmission, trying to hear not just the words, but the tension buried underneath them, trying to assess from tone and cadence alone whether something was developing that the words weren't saying. In public, for decades, he described this period as almost serene, a meditative solitude, the universe spread out around him, the moon rotating slowly below. He gave the press the story they seemed to want. But here is what no one was saying out loud. The version he finally told in his last years was nothing like that. The 24 hours of solo orbit, he admitted, were characterized primarily by fear. Not fear of dying. He had made peace with that before he ever climbed into the rocket. But fear of surviving. Fear of what surviving without his crewmates would mean, and what it would require of him. And in the back of his mind, every orbit, were 2 names he never said publicly during those 50 years. Janet Armstrong, Pat Aldrin, the women waiting on Earth, the women he was rehearsing words for, alone behind the moon, in case the engine on the surface didn't fire. He ran emergency procedures through his mind continuously, not because he expected to need them, but because the weight of the contingency plan sat on him like a physical pressure that could only be relieved by preparation. Every time he passed behind the moon and the radio cut out, he was sealed inside 48 minutes of total silence. The mechanical sounds of the spacecraft, his own heartbeat, and the knowledge that whatever was happening on the surface was happening without him and beyond his reach. He had no ability to help. He had no ability to know. He could only orbit and listen and prepare for the version of events where he came home alone. And right now, he still didn't know whether the landing had even worked. The landing they almost didn't make. The descent of Eagle toward the lunar surface was one of the most dangerous 12 minutes in the history of human spaceflight. Collins was overhead, listening, while his crewmates fell toward the moon. At roughly 33,000 feet above the surface, the guidance computer began flashing an alarm. Program. Alarm 1202. Armstrong called it up. 2. Mission control. Nobody, not Armstrong, not Aldrin, not the controllers in Houston, recognized it immediately. They were looking at an alarm code that hadn't come up in training, on a system nobody fully understood in real time, with the landing clock running and the abort window shrinking by the second. In mission control, the call landed on a 26-year-old guidance officer named Steve Bales, the youngest person in that room. A compact, focused engineer who had spent months memorizing computer alarm tables precisely for a moment like this. He had 3 lives in his hands and about 4 seconds to decide. His voice was steady when he gave the call, "Go." The computer was overloaded but still functional. Continue the descent. It was the right call. It was made under pressure, with incomplete information, in seconds. Nobody in that room was certain. Collins, listening from orbit, heard every word. He heard the tension. He heard the alarm call-outs and the brief silences. Between them, he heard mission control wrestling in real time with a problem that could end the mission, or end his crewmates. He knew that if the descent had to be aborted, Armstrong and Aldrin would have exactly one chance to launch from the surface and attempt rendezvous with him. One chance. And if that rendezvous failed, he didn't finish that thought. He already knew what came after it, but the alarm wasn't the worst of it. What happened next, in the final minutes of descent, was something the public didn't fully understand for years. Armstrong took manual control of the lunar module. The navigation system had been guiding Eagle toward a landing site that turned out to be a boulder field, rocks the size of cars scattered across the surface below. Armstrong looked at it, made his decision, and flew past it. He flew the lunar module horizontally across the lunar surface, burning fuel, scanning for anything flat enough to land on. The gauges ticked down. 60 seconds. Of fuel. 30 seconds. He set Eagle down with less than 30 seconds of fuel remaining. If he had needed 15 more seconds to find a clear surface, the descent would have had to be aborted. That abort had never been tested in actual lunar conditions. It might have failed, and if it had failed, Collins would not be listening for a voice on the radio. Collins was on the far side of the moon when Eagle touched down. He was behind the moon in the 48-minute blackout, with no radio contact with anyone. He did not hear Armstrong say, "The Eagle has landed." He did not hear Mission Control's response. He did not know, for those long, orbiting minutes, whether his crewmates had touched the surface, aborted, or gone silent forever. He was still rehearsing words for Janet Armstrong and Pat Aldrin when the moon's edge slid past and the radio crackled back to life. Maximum anxiety. Mission Control's report came through as Collins emerged from behind the moon. Eagle was on its surface, intact. The landing had succeeded. And get this, Collins did not celebrate. The relief he felt was real, but it was not the relief of a man who believed the danger was over. It was the relief of a man who had just cleared one obstacle and could now see the next one clearly. The ascent stage appeared functional. They had reached the surface in one piece. They still had, as far as anyone could tell, the capability to launch. The contingency plan had not been activated. Not yet. While the world watched Armstrong and Aldrin walk on the moon, while families crowded around television sets in living rooms across the planet, while the footage of that first step played on screens in Times Square and Trafalgar Square, and living rooms from Lagos to Tokyo, Collins was in the command module reviewing emergency rendezvous procedures. He was checking systems. He was watching the mission timeline with the focus of a man who understood that every minute Armstrong and Aldrin spent on the surface was a minute during which something could go wrong that prevented them from ever leaving it. The spacesuits could fail. Equipment could malfunction. In the moon's fractional gravity, a stumble could injure an astronaut in ways that ended the mission. The ascent engine, a single engine with no backup, had never been tested in actual lunar conditions. Every minute of the moonwalk was a minute of exposure, a minute of risk. A minute during which Collins might need to activate procedures he had rehearsed and prayed he would never use. He thought about Janet Armstrong watching from home. He thought about Pat Aldrin. He thought about what it would mean if the next transmission he heard was not his crewmates' voices, but silence where their voices should have been. But here is what no one was saying out loud. The world watching on television was experiencing triumph. Collins, 60 miles above, was experiencing something closer to a controlled, sustained horror. Managed through procedure and discipline and the professional training of a man who understood exactly how many things could still go wrong. He wanted them to finish. He wanted them back inside the lunar module, hatch sealed, protected by the spacecraft again. He wanted to hear the words cabin pressurized and know they had made it back inside. When those words finally came through, when Armstrong reported hatch sealed, cabin pressurized, They were back inside Eagle and preparing for rest before the ascent. Collins admitted the relief was so sudden and so overwhelming that it was almost physical. They were alive. They were inside. They still had a chance to come home, but the ascent engine still hadn't fired. The launch that had to work. The ascent stage engine was a single engine, no redundancy, no backup. If it failed to ignite, there was no second attempt. If it ignited but produced insufficient thrust, the ascent trajectory would be wrong and rendezvous might be impossible. If the stage failed to separate cleanly from the descent stage, the weight of the hardware they couldn't shed would drag them back toward the surface. Collins had rehearsed each of these scenarios. He had sat with the exact knowledge of what each failure meant and what he would be required to do in response. He had made, in whatever way a person can make such a thing, a private peace with the version of events where he fired the engine and aimed for Earth. The ascent engine fired. Eagle climbed. The ascent stage rose from the lunar surface cleanly, on trajectory, and Collins began the rendezvous sequence. The hours of precise maneuvering that would bring the two spacecraft together in lunar orbit. He used radar, optical sighting, and manual thruster inputs to close the distance. Small burns, precisely timed, bleeding off the differential velocity between the two spacecraft, drawing Columbia and Eagle together across the silence of lunar orbit. It was the maneuver he had practiced hundreds of times in simulation. Now it was real, with Armstrong and Aldrin inside that approaching speck of light, and everything depending on inputs he was making alone. The distance closed. Eagle grew from a point of light to a shape, from a shape to a spacecraft. And then, the confession. The docking latches engaged with a sound Collins would describe, for the rest of his life, as one of the most beautiful things he had ever heard. A single mechanical thunk. Metal finding metal. Two spacecraft becoming one. He sat with it for a moment before he opened the tunnel. Just that sound and the knowledge behind it. His crewmates were alive. They were 6 feet away, on the other side of a hatch, waiting to come through. The contingency plan was over. The speech President Nixon had prepared would stay in its folder. Janet Armstrong and Pat Aldrin would not need the words Collins had been rehearsing for 24 hours. He did not have to leave anyone behind. When Armstrong and Aldrin came through the tunnel, Collins later admitted, the relief that had been building for 24 hours, that had been compressing itself under discipline and procedure and professional focus since the moment Eagle undocked, finally released. And in the brief privacy before they fully transferred into the command module, alone with the magnitude of what had just not happened, Michael Collins wept. Not for the cameras, not for mission control, not for the crowds who were at that moment cheering in cities across the planet. In the privacy of his spacecraft, the man who had spent the most famous day of the 20th century preparing to return as the sole survivor of humanity's greatest achievement, wept, quietly, because he didn't have to. That is the confession the title promised. That is what he carried for 50 years. The world was celebrating a moon landing. Collins was grieving the version of events that didn't happen, and the relief of not having to be the man who came home alone. This is the story that history buried, and it is not finished yet. The weight of coming home. Armstrong and Aldrin transferred back through the docking tunnel into Columbia. They brought lunar samples and camera film. They jettisoned the ascent stage and fired Columbia's engine to break lunar orbit. The 3-day journey home began. The return trip was supposed to be the exhale, the victory lap, the relaxed phase. Collins admitted he couldn't relax. Too many things could still fail. The service module engine had to fire for the correct duration, at the correct moment to break lunar orbit. The heat shield had to survive atmospheric re-entry temperatures that would vaporize metal. The parachutes had to deploy in sequence. Only when Columbia splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24, 1969, only when Collins could see the helicopters from the USS Hornet approaching across the water, did he finally release the tension he had carried since Launch 8 days earlier. All 3 of them were alive. He hadn't had to activate the contingency plan. He hadn't had to leave anyone behind. But the psychological weight of what he had been prepared to do did not leave him when the hatch opened. It stayed. It shaped the next 50 years in ways he spent most of that time not discussing. What he kept quiet. In the years after Apollo 11, Collins watched what fame did to his crewmates with the detached attention of a man who had narrowly avoided something. Neil Armstrong became a recluse, retreating from public life, giving almost no interviews, clearly overwhelmed by the impossible weight of being humanity's first moonwalker. A man treated as a legend who only wanted to be treated as a man. Buzz Aldrin struggled publicly with depression and alcoholism, wrestling with the question of what your life means after you've done the greatest thing any human has done before the age of 40. Collins left NASA in 1970, less than a year after Apollo 11. He ran the National Air and Space Museum. He wrote books. He lived quietly. And he said often that being forgotten was partly a gift, that the intensity of fame that seemed to be slowly destroying his crewmates had passed him by, and that he was grateful for it. And get this? That was real. But it was also a half-truth he had been telling so long, it had started to sound complete. Because what he wasn't saying, through thousands of interviews and decades of public appearances, was the full account of what those 24 hours had actually been like. The fear that had nothing to do with dying, the words he had rehearsed for Janet Armstrong and Pat Aldrin, the sound of the 1202 alarms, and Steve Bales' steady voice, and the horrible helplessness of listening from orbit while the men he was responsible for bringing home fell toward the lunar surface in a machine nobody had ever landed before. He wasn't saying that the mission succeeded as much through luck and improvisation as through preparation. That Armstrong's manual flight across the Boulder Field in the final minutes of descent was a desperate search for any flat ground before the fuel ran out. That if any one of a dozen small things had gone differently, a different landing site, 4 more seconds of searching, a slightly different computer alarm, the contingency plan would have been activated, and he would have said those words to those 2 women, and history would be a different shape. He started saying all of it in his last years, quietly, without drama. The way a person tells the truth when they've run out of reasons not to. The truth he finally told. Michael Collins died on April 28, 2021, at age 90, after a battle with cancer. The tributes acknowledged finally that his role in Apollo 11 was not lesser than his crewmates, just different, that the mission required all 3 positions, and that the command module pilot who kept the ship alive in lunar orbit and flew the rendezvous that brought everyone home was not the forgotten one, but the one the other 2 depended on to exist at all. But even the best tributes couldn't fully carry what Collins had admitted in his last years, because what he had finally confessed was not a fact. It was an experience. The specific texture of 24 hours spent preparing in complete isolation to do the thing he prayed he wouldn't have to do. He spent the most celebrated day of the 20th century with 2 women's names in his mind and a speech he might have to improvise when no speech would be adequate. He listened to transmissions from the surface knowing that every crackle of static could be the last signal he would hear from the men below. He rehearsed, orbit after orbit, what he would say to Janet Armstrong and Pat Aldrin. He made peace with the engine burn that would take him home alone. And when the latches engaged, when that single mechanical thunk told him his crewmates were alive and 6 feet away and coming. Through the tunnel, the weight of everything he had been holding for 24 hours came down all at once. He wept in the privacy of his spacecraft while Mission Control celebrated and the world cheered. The forgotten astronaut, alone with the version of Apollo 11 that didn't happen, feeling the specific grief of relief that is so large it has nowhere to go. That was the confession, not a dramatic revelation in a press conference, not a deathbed statement written for posterity. Just a man, in his final years, finally telling the truth about what it had actually felt like, because he had carried it long enough, and because the truth, he had decided, was more important than the myth. The public story of Apollo 11 is a story of triumphant, flawless execution. The story Collins finally told is messier, more frightening, and ultimately more human. It is a story of ordinary people doing something extraordinary while terrified, improvising when the plan stopped holding, accepting burdens that would never fully leave them, and succeeding not through perfection, but through desperate determination, precise skill, and a great deal of luck. Michael Collins was not the forgotten astronaut. He was the one who made it possible for the other 2 to be remembered at all. If this story changed how you see Apollo 11, leave a comment, because the version Collins finally told deserves the conversation it never got. And if you want more stories that history quietly buried, subscribe, Collins kept his secret for 50 years. We're only getting started.